There is a passage in Genesis that most Bible teachers skip, not because it is obscure, not because it is unimportant, because it is uncomfortable. Because what it describes, in 4 precise, carefully worded verses, raises questions that neat theology has never fully answered. Questions about the nature of evil, about the boundaries God set at creation, about what really triggered the flood, and about a warning Jesus gave about the end of the world that almost nobody connects to this passage. Genesis 6:1-4. 4 verses, sitting right before the account of Noah and the flood. So close to the flood narrative that most readers assume they are simply background detail, a vague reference to human wickedness before moving on to the ark. But what no one knew was that these 4 verses are not background. They are the explanation, the reason the flood came, the crime so severe, so cosmically disruptive, so threatening to the entire structure of creation that God looked at the earth and said, "I will blot out man whom I have created." And buried inside this passage is a secret that connects Genesis to the book of Enoch, to the letters of Peter and Jude, to the Nephilim who terrified the spies in Numbers, to the prophecy of Jesus about the last days, and to a spiritual reality that is more relevant to the world you are living in right now than most people are prepared to hear. Welcome to the Journey Bible Stories. Subscribe right now, because today we are opening the passage most pulpits avoid, and what we find inside will change how you read the entire Bible. This is the sin nobody talks about in Genesis, and what happened next left everyone in shock. Let's begin. To understand the weight of Genesis 6:1-4, we need to understand the world it describes, because the passage does not appear in a vacuum. It appears at the end of a long descent, a deterioration that began in a garden and accelerated with terrifying speed. Genesis 1-2, creation, everything good, the boundaries between heaven and earth, between land and sea, between human and animal, between man and woman, all established, ordered, clear. God looked at everything he had made and said, "It is very good." Genesis 3, the first boundary violation. A serpent, a creature from the created order, steps outside its designated role and speaks to the woman about God. The boundary between creature and creator speech is crossed. The humans eat what they were told not to eat. The boundary between obedience and disobedience is crossed. They hide from God. The boundary between intimacy and shame is crossed. One violation, and the entire order begins to unravel. Genesis 4, Cain kills Abel. The boundary between human life, sacred, made in God's image, and violence is crossed. Cain is marked and sent away, but his descendant Lamech takes 2 wives, boasts of killing a man, and declares that he deserves vengeance 77-fold. The violence is escalating. Genesis 5, the genealogy from Adam to Noah, 10 generations, each entry with the same tragic refrain, "And he died, and he died, and he died." The one exception, Enoch, who walked with God and was taken, a single light in a long list of deaths. And then, Genesis 6:1, when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them. The population is growing, the violence is escalating, the distance from Eden is increasing, and into this world comes the sin that breaks the final boundary. But what no one knew was that the boundary about to be broken was the most fundamental one in all of creation, not the boundary between good and evil, the boundary between heaven and earth. We need to read the passage carefully, word by word, because the history of its misinterpretation is almost as interesting as the passage itself. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. 4 verses, and every phrase is contested. The sons of God, Bene ha-Elohim in Hebrew. This phrase appears 3 other times in the Old Testament, Job 1.6, Job 2.1, and Job 38.7. In all 3 Job passages, it refers without question to heavenly beings, members of the divine council, the angelic host. Never in the Hebrew Bible does this phrase refer to human beings. The daughters of man, Benot ha-Adam, clearly human women. They took as their wives any they chose. The language of taking, lakach, combined with any they chose, suggests something other than ordinary courtship. A forcing, a selecting without regard for consent or boundary. The Nephilim, from the Hebrew root nephal, meaning to fall, or those who have fallen, or those who cause others to fall. Beings of enormous stature. Numbers 13:33. The spies who scout Canaan report seeing the Nephilim there, and say that beside them they felt like grasshoppers. And the mighty men, Gibborim, warriors, heroes, men of renown. But what no one knew was the theological earthquake hidden in this passage. If the sons of God are heavenly beings, angels, then Genesis 6:1-4 is describing a violation of the most fundamental boundary in creation, the boundary between heaven and earth, between the spiritual realm and the physical realm, between the order God established and the chaos that threatens it. And the flood that follows 5 verses later is not simply a response to human wickedness. It is a response to a cosmic boundary violation of the highest order. For 2,000 years, 3 major interpretations of Genesis 6:1-4 have competed for theological dominance. We need to understand all 3, because the one you accept determines how you read the rest of the Bible. Interpretation 1. The Sethite view. The sons of God are the godly descendants of Seth, Adam's 3rd son, born after Abel's murder. The daughters of man are the ungodly descendants of Cain. The sin is intermarriage between the faithful line and the pagan line, the dilution of covenant faithfulness through spiritually unequal relationships. This view became dominant in the Western Church after the 4th century, largely because it avoided the theological difficulties of the angelic interpretation. It is tidy, safe, applicable, but it has serious problems. The phrase sons of God never means descendants of Seth anywhere in the Old Testament. The phrase daughters of man would then mean daughters of Cain's line, but the Hebrew says daughters of man, not daughters of Cain. And most critically, intermarriage between 2 human groups, however spiritually problematic, does not obviously produce giants, or explain why it warranted the complete destruction of all life on earth. Interpretation 2. The divine king's view. The sons of God are human rulers, kings and powerful men who claim divine status and use their power to build harems, taking any woman they chose by force. The sin is tyranny, royal abuse of power. This interpretation has historical support from ancient Near Eastern contexts, where kings often claimed divine lineage. But it faces the same problem as the Sethite view. Human tyrants taking multiple wives does not obviously produce giants or warrant a global flood. Interpretation 3. The angelic view. The sons of God are angelic beings who crossed the boundary between the spiritual and physical realms and produced hybrid offspring, the Nephilim. This is the oldest interpretation, held by the earliest Jewish and Christian sources, the Book of Enoch, Josephus, Philo, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen. But what no one knew was that the New Testament itself weighs in on this question, and its verdict is unmistakable. The debate about Genesis 6 does not have to remain unresolved, because the New Testament authors, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, reference this event directly, and what they say is not ambiguous. 2 Peter 2, 4-5. Peter connects two events in immediate sequence. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Angels when they sinned, immediately followed by the flood. The connection is explicit. The angels whose sin triggered the flood, are currently chained in darkness awaiting judgment. Jude 6:7 is even more specific. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Angels who did not stay within their own position, who left their proper dwelling. And Jude compares their sin directly to the sexual immorality of Sodom and Gomorrah, pursued unnatural desire. The comparison is precise. The angels pursued a desire that crossed the boundary of their nature, as the men of Sodom pursued desire that crossed the boundary of theirs. Both were violations of the order God established. Both received severe judgment. But what no one knew was that Jude quotes the book of Enoch directly in verse 14 of the same letter, confirming that the Enochian tradition about the watchers is the interpretive framework he is using for Genesis 6. The New Testament authors understood Genesis 6:1-4 as describing angelic beings who crossed into the physical realm. The Sethite interpretation is a later development, adopted not because it is more textually accurate, but because it is more theologically comfortable. Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. The Hebrew, Nephilim, has generated more scholarly debate than almost any other word in the Old Testament. The root nephal means to fall. The Nephilim are either those who have fallen, referring to their angelic origin, or those who cause others to fall, referring to their effect on humanity, or possibly both simultaneously. What the text tells us about them is limited but striking. They were on the earth in those days, before the flood, and also afterward. That afterward is one of the most significant and most overlooked phrases in the passage. It implies that the phenomenon recurred after the flood, which explains what the spies of Israel encountered in Canaan. Numbers 13:33. 12 spies sent by Moses to scout the promised land return with a report. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. The sons of Anak, a people of enormous stature inhabiting Canaan, described as Nephilim, causing 10 of the 12 spies to conclude, "We cannot go up against these people, for they are stronger than we are." And the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, with its command to completely destroy certain peoples, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the various ites, takes on a different theological character when you understand this background. The destruction was not ethnic. It was targeted specifically at the corrupted lines, at the physical remnant of the Genesis 6 violation. But what no one knew was the most famous Nephilim encounter in all of Scripture. 1 Samuel 17. Goliath of Gath, 6 cubits and a span, 9 feet tall, his brother Lami, his son with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. The family of giants from Gath, Anakim, connected to the Nephilim line. David's battle with Goliath was not just a story about a young man with a sling. It was the final confrontation with the last remnant of the Genesis 6 corruption in the Promised Land. If the sons of God were angelic beings who crossed into the physical realm and produced hybrid offspring, why did that trigger a flood that destroyed all life on earth? The judgment seems disproportionate unless we understand what was actually at stake. Genesis 6:5-7. Immediately after the Nephilim passage, The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it was grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals, and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. Every intention, only evil, continually, the total corruption of human moral imagination. But here is what the passage implies, and the book of Enoch makes explicit. The corruption was not simply behavioral, it was genetic. The mixing of angelic and human natures had produced a corruption that was spreading through the human population and threatening to contaminate the very line through which God had promised that a Redeemer would come. Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelium, the first gospel. God tells the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. The offspring of the woman, the seed through which salvation would come. If the human genetic line was sufficiently corrupted by the Genesis 6 violation, if the image of God in humanity was being systematically distorted, then the promise of Genesis 3:15 was under direct threat. But what no one knew was why Noah was chosen. Genesis 6:9 says, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. The Hebrew, tamim, means without blemish, complete, perfect. The same word used for animals without defect acceptable for sacrifice. Some scholars read Noah's blamelessness not only morally but physically. He was without corruption. His line had not been contaminated. He and his family represented the uncorrupted human image of God. The flood was not simply a moral reset. It was a preservation of the one family through whom the promised seed could still come. The flood was not an act of destruction. It was an act of rescue, of the future. After the flood, what happened to the sons of God who had crossed the boundary? The New Testament answers with unusual precision. They are not free. They are not operating in the world. They are imprisoned. 2 Peter 2:4. Chains of gloomy darkness. Tartarus, the Greek word Peter uses, is Tartaru, from Tartarus, the deepest pit in Greek mythology, below Hades itself. The word appears only once in the entire New Testament, and Peter uses it specifically for the angels who sinned in the context of the flood. And Jude 6, eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. These beings are not the fallen angels who roam the earth in the present age, the spiritual forces Paul describes in Ephesians 6. They are specifically imprisoned, specifically chained, specifically awaiting a specific judgment. But what no one knew was the theological implication of their imprisonment. The book of Enoch describes Enoch himself being sent as a messenger to these imprisoned beings, to deliver God's verdict that there would be no forgiveness, no release, no second chance. Their judgment is certain and final, and the reason their judgment is more severe than that of other fallen spiritual beings, more severe than the general category of demonic activity in the world, is the nature of the violation. They did not simply rebel against God. They crossed the most fundamental boundary in creation. They left their proper domain, their God-assigned position in the spiritual realm, and invaded the physical realm in a way that was never permitted. The boundary between heaven and earth is not incidental, it is structural. It is part of the order God established at creation, and its violation demanded a response proportional to its severity. A flood that reset the physical world, and chains that have held its perpetrators for the thousands of years since. Jude places Genesis 6 and Sodom and Gomorrah in direct parallel. Just as the angels pursued unnatural desire, so Sodom and Gomorrah likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. The connection Jude draws is not incidental, it is structural. Both events involve a violation of the boundaries of created order. Both involve the pursuit of desires that cross the lines God established at creation. Both receive judgment of absolute severity. But there is a specific detail in the Sodom narrative that Jude's comparison illuminates in a way most readings miss. Genesis 19. 2 angels arrive at Sodom. Lot takes them into his house. The men of Sodom surround the house and demand that Lot bring out the visitors so that they may know them. The Hebrew yada, to know, used in its sexual sense. The men of Sodom wanted to have sexual relations with angels, with beings from the spiritual realm. But what no one knew was the inversion this represents. In Genesis 6, spiritual beings crossed into the physical realm to pursue human women. In Genesis 19, human beings attempt to force spiritual beings into sexual contact. The direction of the violation is reversed, but the nature of the violation is identical. The boundary between the spiritual and physical realms was being crossed in both directions. Jude's parallel is not simply about sexual immorality in general. It is about this specific category, the pursuit of what God has not permitted, the reaching across the boundaries of created order for what belongs to a different realm. And the judgment in both cases is severe, sudden, and total. The flood in Genesis 6, fire and sulfur from heaven in Genesis 19. The pattern is consistent. God has established boundaries between realms. Their violation produces judgment proportional to the violation's severity, and the severity is always greater than it appears from inside the story. Matthew 24, 37-39. Jesus is teaching his disciples about the signs of the end of the age, and the historical moment he reaches for, the comparison he uses to describe the days before his return, is the days of Noah. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man, eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, unaware, until the flood came. Most readings of this passage focus on the normalcy, people going about their ordinary lives, spiritually unprepared for what is coming, and that is certainly present. But what no one knew was the specific phrase Jesus uses, marrying and giving in marriage. In the context of the days of Noah, in the context of Genesis 6:1-4, this phrase carries additional weight. The sons of God took as wives any they chose. The marrying of Genesis 6 was not ordinary marital activity. It was the specific violation that defined the pre-flood world. Jesus is not simply saying, people will be spiritually indifferent before my return. He is pointing to the specific character of the pre-flood world, the Genesis 6 world, as the template for the last days. Luke 17:26-30 adds the parallel with Sodom. As it was in the days of Noah, as it was in the days of Lot, the two events Jude places in parallel, Jesus places in parallel. And the warning embedded in both parallels is not primarily about immorality in general. It is about a specific category of spiritual and physical boundary violation, and about the spiritual blindness of a world that does not see the judgment coming until it arrives. To fully understand why Genesis 6 triggered the most severe judgment in the pre-Sinai narrative, we need to return to the theological foundation laid in Genesis 1. Genesis 1:26-27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. The image of God, imago Dei, the most fundamental theological statement about human beings in the entire Bible. Not that humans are divine, but that they bear a unique resemblance to God, a capacity for relationship, for moral reasoning, for creative action, for dominion over creation that no other creature possesses. The image of God is what makes human life sacred. It is the basis for the prohibition against murder in Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. The image is the reason human life has infinite value. But what no one knew was what the Genesis 6 violation was doing to the image of God. If the sons of God were angelic beings who produced hybrid offspring with human women, then the Nephilim were not fully image bearers. They were something else, something that had the physical form of humanity, but not the full theological status of the image of God. And as the Nephilim multiplied, as the corruption spread, the population of genuine image bearers was being diluted, replaced. The very thing that made humanity sacred, the very thing that made the promise of Genesis 3:15 possible, the pure human lineage through which the seed of the woman would come, was under existential threat. The flood was not the destruction of the image, it was the preservation of it. In 8 people, Noah, his wife, his sons, their wives, the uncorrupted image of God was preserved through the catastrophe, and from that preserved image, the long story of redemption continued, toward Abraham, toward David, toward Bethlehem. Numbers 13-14, 12 spies. 40 days in Canaan, and the report that broke Israel's courage, there are giants in the land, the sons of Anak. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers. The Anakim, descendants of Anak, are connected throughout the Old Testament to the Rephaim, to the Nephilim, to the giant clans that inhabited Canaan. Deuteronomy 2-3 describes the Rephaim as a people as tall as the Anakim, whose king Og had a bed of iron 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. And the command to Israel regarding these peoples was total destruction, herem, the complete dedication to destruction, not subjugation, not conversion, destruction. This has troubled readers of the Old Testament for centuries. How could a God of love command the complete destruction of entire peoples, including women and children? But what no one knew was the theological context that explains it. The command for herem was not applied uniformly to all Canaanite peoples. Rahab was spared. The Gibeonites negotiated peace and were incorporated. The command for total destruction was targeted, specifically at the giant clans, the Anakim and the Rephaim, the peoples connected to the Nephilim line. And when Joshua's conquest is read with this in mind, the geography of herem follows the distribution of the giant clans. Joshua 11:21-22. Joshua destroyed the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the people of Israel, except in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, 3 cities from which centuries later Goliath of Gath would emerge. The unfinished work of Joshua became the challenge of David. The giant in 1 Samuel 17 was the last remnant of the Genesis 6 corruption. And the shepherd boy with a sling, the ancestor of Jesus, was the one who finished what the conquest had started. Ephesians 6:10-12, Paul's famous passage about spiritual warfare, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces in heavenly places. Paul describes a hierarchy of spiritual opposition, a structured system of spiritual entities operating in the unseen realm, arrayed against the people of God. The language is precise and deliberate. These are not vague metaphors for human evil. They are distinct categories of spiritual opposition with their own hierarchy and their own operations. But what no one knew was the connection to Genesis 6. The imprisoned sons of God, chained in Tartarus since the flood, are not the same beings Paul describes in Ephesians 6. Those beings are active, operational, present in the world right now, opposing the church. The Genesis 6 violation produced 2 consequences. The physical consequence, the Nephilim, was addressed by the flood and completed in the conquest. But the spiritual consequence, the corruption of the spiritual realm, the establishment of demonic territorial authority over the nations, continued. Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. The nations of the earth were assigned to spiritual beings, and those spiritual beings, the gods of the nations, became the cosmic powers Paul describes. Daniel 10. The angel who comes to Daniel was delayed for 21 days by the prince of Persia, a spiritual being with territorial authority over the Persian Empire. The prince of Greece was next. The spiritual warfare Paul describes in Ephesians 6 has a backstory, and that backstory begins in Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelium. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. Two seeds, two lines, in conflict from the beginning. The seed of the serpent, the forces opposed to God's redemptive purpose, and the seed of the woman, the line through which the Redeemer would come. The entire Old Testament can be read as the story of the seed war, every attempt to corrupt, eliminate, or interrupt the line that leads to Jesus. Cain kills Abel, the righteous line threatened. Seth is born, the line continues. The Genesis 6 violation, angelic corruption of the human line, threatens the image of God. Noah preserves the uncorrupted line through the flood. Abraham's wife Sarah is taken twice into foreign harems. The mother of the promised seed placed in jeopardy. God intervenes both times. The Egyptian Pharaoh orders the death of all Hebrew male infants, the entire covenant people threatened. Moses survives. The line continues. Haman plots the genocide of all Jews in the Persian Empire. Esther intervenes. The line continues. Herod orders the death of all male children in Bethlehem under 2 years old. The seed of the woman has arrived, and the opposition reaches its most desperate intensity. Jesus escapes to Egypt. The line continues. But what no one knew was the culmination of the seed war. Galatians 3:16. Paul quotes Genesis 3:15 and says, "It does not say seeds, as referring to many, but referring to one, and to your seed, that is, Christ." The seed of the woman is Jesus. The entire conflict from Genesis 3 to Calvary was the serpent's increasingly desperate attempt to prevent the seed from arriving. Every attack on the covenant line, the Genesis 6 corruption, the Nephilim in Canaan, the assassination plots, the genocides, was aimed at the same target. At Calvary, the serpent struck the heel, but the seed crushed the head. The war is over. The seed has come. Colossians 2:15. Paul describes what happened at the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Disarmed, put to open shame, triumphed over. The same rulers and authorities of Ephesians 6, the cosmic powers whose authority traces back to the Genesis 6 corruption, who had claimed dominion over the nations, were disarmed at the cross. Not by a military victory, by a death and a resurrection that broke the legal basis of their authority. The accusation against humanity that we are guilty, that we deserve judgment, was satisfied at the cross. And without that accusation, the powers have no legal standing. They are disarmed, not destroyed yet, but disarmed. 1 Peter 3:18-22. Peter, the same apostle who referenced the imprisoned angels in 2 Peter 2, says that after the resurrection, Christ went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, those who formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, the spirits in prison. The sons of God who crossed the boundary in Genesis 6, still imprisoned since the flood, still awaiting judgment. And the risen Christ announced his victory to them, not to offer redemption, to declare triumph. The one whose bloodline they had tried to corrupt, The seed of the woman they had tried to prevent through the Genesis 6 violation stood before their prison and declared, "It is finished. The seed has come. The head is crushed. Your judgment is certain." But what no one knew was the full implication of that announcement for every person watching this. The powers that the Genesis 6 corruption unleashed, the spiritual forces that have opposed God's purposes in every generation since, are already defeated, disarmed, their authority broken at Calvary, their final judgment certain. The war is over. The seed has won. And the only question remaining is, which side of that victory are you standing on? We have traveled from a garden to a flood to a whirlwind to a cross. We have followed the seed war from Genesis 3 to Calvary. We have seen the sin nobody talks about and understood why the response to it was so severe, so total, so ultimately redemptive. And now the question that every honest listener must ask, what does this mean for the world I am living in right now? Jesus said, as in the days of Noah. The days of Noah were defined by a specific kind of spiritual corruption, by the blurring of boundaries God had established, by a world that was eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, completely unaware of the judgment approaching until it arrived. We live in a world that is systematically dismantling the boundaries of created order, not because of a conspiracy of angels, but because the spirit of lawlessness that the Genesis 6 violation represents has always been present in human history. The desire to cross the lines God set, to be like God, to access what was not permitted, to push past the limits of the created order in pursuit of what lies beyond them. But what no one knew was that the boundaries God established are not arbitrary restrictions. They are the architecture of human flourishing. The lines between heaven and earth, between male and female, between life and death, between the sacred and the profane, these are not cultural preferences. They are structural, and their violation always produces consequences proportional to the violation's depth. The flood did not come because God was angry. It came because the corruption had reached the point where without intervention, the image of God in humanity would have been lost entirely. The redemptive purpose of creation would have been permanently derailed, and the God who acted in Noah's day is still the God who acts, who preserves, who rescues, who sends his seed into the world to crush the head of the corruption. The cross is the final answer to Genesis 6. The flood reset the physical world. The resurrection reset the spiritual world. And the return of Christ will complete what both began. Are you ready for what is coming? 4 verses, hidden in Genesis, between the genealogy of Noah and the account of the flood, passed over by most preachers, avoided by most Sunday school curricula. But those 4 verses contain the key to understanding the flood. The giants in Canaan, the conquest command, Goliath, the spiritual warfare of Ephesians 6, the days of Noah warning in Matthew 24, and the proclamation of the risen Christ to the spirits in prison. The Bible is one story. From Genesis 3:15 to Revelation 22, the seed of the woman against the seed of the serpent, and every attempt to corrupt, eliminate, or interrupt the line that leads to Jesus, including the sin of Genesis 6, was defeated, completely, permanently. At a cross outside Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon, he disarmed them. He put them to open shame. He triumphed. And the seed that the powers of Genesis 6 tried to prevent, that seed is still alive, still reigning, still interceding, and still coming. Subscribe to the Journey Bible Stories right now, because this is what we do here. Every week, the stories beneath the stories, the threads that connect everything. Drop one word in the comments. What surprised you most in this video? Let's talk about it. Share this with someone who thinks they know Genesis. Show them what was hiding in plain sight. See you in the next one.